Raid the Sky Temple is a 5-star card.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, folks, it's time to talk about some overrated Saviors of Uldum cards. These are the ones that both the community and myself rated really highly. We thought they were going to be awesome, but instead aren't making much of an impact on the meta. It turns out things like Mage and Warrior are raining down on these cards, and they just haven't gotten there yet. To give you some insights on how I determined the cards on this list, I basically took their pre-release community rankings from best to worst, compared those against their played rates from most played to least played, seeing which ones had the biggest difference if it ranked first before the expansion and it's only being played the 100th most played card. That's a difference of 100. That would be at the top of this list, for instance, and you'll see that here shortly in the video. Now, I do want to clarify before I get into this, I'm not actually saying that these cards are bad. In fact, I think a few on this list are pretty good and maybe just are being underplayed by the community, but we are just going by their played rate. So even if they have good win rates, for instance, and they should be played more, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've caught on in the meta just yet. Beyond that, I'm not dooming these cards forever. They might turn the corner and get good eventually, much like I need to do myself. And finally, I know some nerfs just hit in Hearthstone, but I think it was actually more important to compare the ratings pre-nerf than post-nerf, because the ratings made before the expansion released were based on cards like Dr. Boom at 7 mana and Luna's Pocket Galaxy at 5 mana. So looking at them after the nerfs would actually be a much worse way to interpret this data. So we're keeping it consistent with people's expectations by looking at the pre-nerf stats. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list. At the number 5 spot to kick things off is Activate the Obelisk, which was ranked inside the top 10 before the expansion. People thought this one was going to be really, really good, really influential. I got yelled at a lot for giving this card 3 stars. You're crazy, Regis. You're an idiot. So on and so forth. Some of you are out there watching right now. I see you. I see you. Instead of being top 10, it's actually ranking outside the top 50 right now. Pretty much a fringe meta card. There are a couple decent decks, for the record, for Activate the Obelisk. Things like Quest Wall Priest are very competitive. It just hasn't gained a lot of popularity because Combo Priest is ahead of it. So, for the record, I do think Activate the Obelisk is a good card. I think it's going to be played more, perhaps immediately in this post-nerf meta, and it might just take a little while for it to catch on. So, my 3-star rating, it may actually end up underrating this card by the time all is said and done, but for now, based on what people expected, this card has underperformed. Now, 52nd isn't terrible, right? That's in the top half of all cards in the expansion, but it's certainly still not top 10. So even though it may not look like this card's bad, people still vastly overrated it because they thought it was going to be one of the best cards in the set. Instead, it looks like it's somewhere in the middle of the pack. And usually there are only like 30 great cards in a set. So the fact that this is currently outside the top 50, that's a really big difference, even if it's not a bad card. So now let's take a look at Plague of Morlocks, a card which is just outside the top half, arguably right in the middle of all cards in Saviors of Uldum, despite being ranked just outside the top 20. And this is another card people said was going to be amazing. A lot of people thought this was a 5-star card. Actually got some criticism for giving this one 4 stars, which it turns out is still overrating Plague of Morlocks. Like, I got it wrong too, but still got criticized for not being positive enough. Again, a card I think it's going to be solid someday. It's just not lining up in the meta right now. But it turns out Murloc Shaman is really, really good on its own without having to turn other things into Murlocs. There's no really viable control Shaman build right now. Battlecry Shaman can run this card, but tends to do other things. So it's just kind of gotten left at the wayside right now, even though there was a lot of hype for this card. And I think that hype will eventually be somewhat satisfied. Right now, it's just awkward. I've had fun playing this card. I think it does some pretty cool things, just not lining up. Maybe in the post-nerf meta, a Control Shaman will come to prominence and Plague of Morlocks will get there. But for now, pretty vastly underperforming its nearly top 20 ranking. So now moving on to the number 3 spot. This is where things get really crazy in a couple different ways. For instance, Vicina up here is 70 spots worse than expected. Another card ranked in the top 25, which puts it pretty highly up there as far as playability is concerned, but in the bottom 40 cards nearly, of the expansion, that is bad. That's way down there. If you look at cards that are at those spots, it's crazy what Vicina is next to. And the craziest thing about this is that Vicina is actually a great card. If you look at her win rate for both deck and played win rates, Vicina looks fantastic. And there are some really good aggro overload shamans out there that are utilizing Vicina very successfully. Despite the win rate and the power of these decks, she's just not at all popular and hasn't caught on in the meta. So I had a bit of a weird approach to this card, like should I include it in the video or not, since it's already great. Like looking at those past two cards, they seem good, but they don't really have the data to back it up. If you look at their win rates, they're sub 50%, so they're not performing excellently. But Vicina actually performs really, really well. So I debated whether or not to include this card, but based on my methodology, it certainly fits because it's way, way less played than we might have expected. But it's perhaps, despite being overrated from a pre-expansion standpoint, actually an underrated card in a lot of ways because it's just not getting the attention that it deserves. So simultaneously, perhaps, maybe for the first time ever, one of the most overrated and one of the most underrated cards in Saviors of Uldum, which is pretty nutty. Up next at the number 2 spot, we have a tie actually for second and first. But let's talk about Wretched Reclaimer up first, ranked 32nd, and instead played 106th. A enormous 74 spot difference here with Wretched Reclaimer. And it's interesting, there were a lot of priest cards that were nearly on this list. People were talking about priest and how good it was going to be. All these new cards, like every priest card seems awesome. Penance and Sandhoof Dude. And by the way, both of those just barely missed this list. Wretched Reclaimer is awesome. Psychopomp's great, and it is, by the way. That's the one that did satisfy our expectations. But it turns out just none of these actually worked for what Priest was doing, which that boiled down combo Priest list didn't need all those things. They were kind of excess, and the package that we were used to got Priest there instead. So all of these, despite looking good in a lot of ways, have just fallen off to the side, not currently seeing play. I actually really, really still like Wretched Reclaimer. I think it's a pretty sweet idea for a card, particularly with like Leroy Jenkins. It's really cool if you can give Leroy Reborn with Embalming Ritual, another card that almost made this list, and then bring it back to life with Wretched Reclaimer. It's this insane damage combo, but nobody's doing that right now because Priest just has other ways to do ridiculous burst damage. So I think this card's solid. It's going to have a chance. I gave it 4 stars. I think it might actually get to that point at someday, but maybe 3 stars is where it's really going to land. For now, not even close to either of those things. Not seeing any significant play at all. So despite people thinking it was going to be a really good card in this set, nonetheless, barely showing up any. And then finally here at the number 1 spot, I gave this one the number 1 because it was a legendary. It's Unka the Buried, ranked 36. So people did think this had some playability. Like I said, top 30, top 40 cards are usually where you start seeing the line where things become unplayable. And instead, almost at the very bottom of the set, far and away the worst legendary, I would argue, in Saviors of Uldum. I thought she had some fringe potential at 3 stars. A lot of people thought this was more like a 4 or 5 star card. I think 3 stars is still overrating it a little. She's right now like 1.5 to 2 stars at best. And it turns out, Rogue just doesn't have this kind of ability to go super late into the game. Post turn 5 with all these kind of shenanigan style things. She's not working well with Mechathune. That just doesn't get there. So all in all, Rogue does much faster, better things without Unka, which means there's just no reason to play this card. I do hope Death Rattle support comes to Rogue and we see some cool new things happen. I would be really excited to see this card work, but I think of any card on the list, this one has the least chance of finding some success in a different meta. I think there are just some fundamental issues with how this one works. So I don't have a lot of hope for Unka. She might stay at that 2-star level. I hope I'm wrong and Blizzard designed some things around her. But unfortunately, she is far and away right now the most overrated currently and will probably stay the most overrated throughout the future as well. So there you go, folks. That wraps it up for the most overrated Saviors of Uldum cards. There were a lot of like moderately overrated cards, things like Dark Pharaoh Takan, things like even you could look at the Druid Quest. So kind of debatable about how to like shape this video and which ones to include. I ultimately went mostly to the numbers, unless something was rated like 60th and was really like 120th. That wasn't compelling. I wanted the cards to be ranked in the top 30 or 40 spots so that we really did see evidence that people thought they were going to be significant cards, and instead they fell way, way lower than that. So a little bit of a mix here of like top 10, top 15 stuff and some top 40 stuff as well. That sounded like a music reference, but it wasn't. But anyway, share what cards you think are overrated in the comments below. I mean, what did you expect would work really well, but you just can't get it to work? Let me know. If you predicted these cards right, of course, go brag in the comments below as well. I didn't really get any of these right. The closest was perhaps the Priest Quest, but even I probably have currently overrated that one, and long term it will look like I've underrated it if I had to guess. So share your takes in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, game on.